Hello and welcome to this Third Pillar Forum panel discussion, looking at how we better fund an ageing population in retirement. I'm Ali Moore and I'm your moderator for this conversation. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, wherever we may be. For us here in the studio, it's the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. One thing we all know is that funding for aged care has become an even more critical issue in 2020. The pandemic has challenged both the health and the finances of older Australians, and it's changed the way many think about staying at home with the aged care sector hit so hard by this crisis. Systemic failures and underfunding have been laid bare, and all eyes will be on the final report of the Aged Care Royal Commission due early next year. We've also had the Retirement Income Review looking at how the pension, superannuation and the so-called third pillar of savings, including home ownership, work together. And while that report is yet to be made public, we already know there are big gaps in the system, with so many, especially women, underfunded in retirement. We know the challenges, the issue is finding solutions. So to our panel this morning. Senator the Honourable Jane Hume, the Assistant Minister for Superannuation, Financial Services and Financial Technology. Senator Hume was appointed to the Australian Federal Ministry in 2019, having been elected as a Liberal Senator in 2016. She's previously had senior positions in the financial services industry, working for NAB, Rothschild Australia, Deutsche Bank, and as a Senior Policy Advisor at Australian Super. With Senator Hume in Sydney is Deanne Stewart, the CEO of Aware Super, which of course used to be called First State Super. Deanne joined Aware as CEO in 2018, and in the past 2 years, Aware has grown to become one of the largest industry funds in Australia. Deanne has overseen the fund's strategic rebrand, its successful merger with Vic Super and WA Super, the integration of the financial planning business, and the refresh of the organisation's strategy. Also in Sydney is Amara Haqqani, the Director of Insights and Strategy at Millennium. Amara is a retirement income and pension specialist and is responsible for the data research and insights function, which looks at retirement and related topics such as pensions management, financial services systems and policy issues, as well as financial advice and investments. And prior to joining Millennium, Amara worked for Challenger. We also have Peter Harris, the former chairman of the Productivity Commission. Peter is an economist with extensive experience in Australian policy, public service and business. Most recently, he was chairman of the Productivity Commission and instrumental in the research and recommendations in reports such as the housing decisions of older Australians and superannuation, assessing efficiency and competitiveness. We have Jean Kitson. Jean is an author with her book, We Need to Talk About Mum and Dad, most relevant to today's conversation. She's also a performer and scriptwriter for stage, television, radio, magazines and newspapers. And she's appeared, as you know, on a range of programs ranging from The Big Gig to The Einstein Factor. She's also well known for her comedy debates for the ABC, Channel 9 and Channel 10. And with me in the studio here in Melbourne, Andrew Boll, the CEO of Rice Warner. Andrew is an experienced financial services professional who specialises in providing actuarial and strategic consulting advice to leading companies and superannuation funds. And prior to joining Rice Warner in 2019, Andrew spent more than 30 years advising clients on super, life insurance, risk management and investments. And also Josh Funder, the CEO and Managing Director of Household Capital, the organisers of today's discussion. Prior to founding the company in 2016, Josh spent over a decade as a partner at GBS, Australia's largest venture funds management firm. He's also co-founder and former chair of Per Capita, whose research on longevity formed part of the inspiration for Household Capital. So if our extensive panel can imagine a virtual round of applause to welcome them to this conversation. Welcome to all of you. Over the next 90 minutes or so, I will direct questions to our various panellists and also take questions from you, the audience. You can ask a question via Twitter using the hashtag Third Pillar Forum. And I do urge you to join the conversation. Given we have so many on the panel, it would be great if you could also direct your question to a particular panellist. So let's get underway with our conversation. Minister Jane Hume, to you first. We've seen some changes in the budget to superannuation, but Accumulation is only one side of this discussion. What's the government doing to ensure a better funded retirement?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, can I just say thank you very much to Household Capital for organising this forum, and what an extraordinary pleasure it is to be here, both in person with two extraordinary women from the financial services sector, but more so in person considering I'm also from Victoria, and I feel like I've been let out of lockdown and into the real world again. So it's great to be in a room with other people. Thank you very much for that question. Ali, I've actually got a bit of an opening statement for you, if you don't mind, before we launch into questions. I really want to say thank you very much again to Josh Funder for organising this function. You know, the concept of the third pillar is actually really important the importance of that third pillar in providing for retirement has been really overlooked, I think, in the policy conversation about retirement so far. And the third pillar, or voluntary savings, is incredibly important to the retirement security of Australians. For many, as we know, the family home is possibly the most significant form of voluntary savings that retirees have historically had, because retirees have historically had a very high level of home ownership compared to other countries in Australia. However, the family home is not actually considered a part of a person's retirement income, which is clear when you look at the underused pensioner loan scheme that's run by the Australian government. Now, this scheme is actually a very innovative and very inexpensive way of adding to your income as a retiree, particularly if you're in an asset-rich and cash flow poor situation. And I'm sure we'll get on to the pensioner loan scheme in a little bit more detail later. But ultimately, what we need to be thinking about is the interaction of all three pillars of the system: the aged pension, superannuation and voluntary savings, and how they work together to deliver for Australians in retirement. Our retirement income system today has many elements that can interact in very complex ways. The caps on superannuation, the means test for the age pension eligibility, and other tax offsets for seniors. They can even make my head spin trying to work out how they all work together. And that's not even to mention the interaction of the retirement income system with other policy frameworks, things like, as you mentioned, aged care, insurance, and of course healthcare as well. And while I can't give you any spoilers into the retirement income review today and into that final report, I can tell you that it looks at how the system allows Australians to achieve adequate retirement incomes. It looks at the cohesion between those pillars, and it looks at those very important issues of equity and adequacy and sustainability as well. As a critical driver of adequate incomes is an efficient superannuation system. And I'd also like to quickly mention today our recently announced changes in this space. So last week's budget included a package of reforms, the Your Future, Your Super package, designed to make super work harder for members. So these reforms will see members stapled to a particular superannuation account to stop the creation of those unintended multiple accounts. We'll also be launching a new online comparison tool called Your Super Comparison Tool to make it easier for people to choose a well-performing product that specifically meets their needs. Funds are also going to be held to account for their underperformance with a new annual performance test. And we're increasing the accountability and transparency by also compelling trustees to act in the best financial interests of their members. So combined, those reforms will see Australians save around $17.9 billion over the next decade in their retirement savings. We want Australians' money, superannuation money, to work harder for them, which of course will ultimately mean a higher standard of living in retirement. So I've covered an awful lot there, Ali, but I think it's probably a good launching pad for the next set of questions.
Yes, and I know you say no spoilers, but there's no question that everyone on this panel, and no doubt everyone listening, is rather keen to see what is in those 650 pages of the Retirement Income Review final report. When do they get to see what you've seen?
Do you know, it's funny you should say that. I had somebody ask me yesterday that they desperately wanted to see it, but could I not give it to them just before Christmas because they needed a rest? And yes, you're right. It is 650 pages. It's a very comprehensive report. Can I say thank you very much to all of those that are listening that contributed to that retirement income review. There were many, many contributions from within the industry and also from think tanks and other interested stakeholders. It is a very comprehensive report. And as I said, it talks about the interaction between the three pillars. It talks about the adequacy, sustainability, equity, and the cohesion between the three pillars. So I think that's actually going to be a really exciting report. I'm hope because it is so big and it doesn't have any recommendations per se, unlike, say, a Productivity Commission report, the government's response needs to be calibrated appropriately. You wouldn't want to put 650 pages out there, I think, and just have people read the headlines. I think that would be a mistake. We want people to take a deep dive and consider, the guts of the report because it has an awful lot in there.
And you've definitely not answered my question at all there. When might you see it?
I'm getting good at this, aren't I? I'm turning into a real live politician, no longer financial services for me. I can say to you that the release of the report is imminent. I cannot tell you the date. It's sitting on the Treasurer's desk right now. The Treasurer has had a fair bit on his desk in the last few months, so I'm sure that this will be next on his to-do list.
And you talked yourself there about the importance of the third pillar, and in the discussion paper for the retirement income review, certainly housing equity was very much put in with the third pillar. So I wonder, just as a point of policy, do you believe that people who can contribute to the cost of their aged care should contribute? And it might be its ownership of the family home, it might be through a loan that is only repaid on death. I look here at suggestions from people like Paul Keating for a HECS-style system where you can access some capital to help fund your aged care. But as a point of policy, do you believe if people are in a position to contribute, they should contribute? I think we have just lost Jane Hume, but we will come back to her, don't worry. So let me ask Andrew Boll, who's here in Melbourne with us. You've heard what Jane said. I'm guessing probably, Andrew, you're sitting there thinking to yourself, well, if just I knew what was in that retirement income review.
Absolutely. We're all desperately waiting to see it. But one thing that the Senator did talk about was cohesion. And that was one of the big takeaways that I had from the whole principles that the panel set themselves when thinking about the review, to think about how all of the things work together. And, that's the key from, we've got the age pension and we've got all the other elements, and how home equity now comes into making retirement better for all Australians. And that's the key. We have so many people leaving money left behind when they die that they could have used better to fund a better lifestyle for themselves.
Peter Harris, can I bring you in as well here? Your thoughts on the Minister's comments, and I guess your reaction in the context of what we do know to what the government's doing and what it's not doing.
Well, yeah, the Productivity Commission did do the three-part report on competition in superannuation back in 2018, and some parts of that, as the detail of the budget announcement indicates, did come based on the Productivity Commission kinds of reports. But there's plenty more to go in retirement income policy. There's a particular angle, I think, that will prove to be quite interesting, potentially, if it's addressed, and that will be the actual purpose of superannuation. Because we've found that to be in the past quite a difficult concept to define. People have many perceptions around what superannuation is, and you referred to Paul Keating's comments, and so certainly the former Prime Minister and Treasurer has a perspective on what superannuation's for, but there are other differences as well. And so I think that'll be an interesting issue to examine when and if the retirement incomes report comes out, and to see whether it's actually addressed in that.
And actually, on that subject, Josh, if I can ask you, this issue of superannuation and then retirement, it's almost like never the twain shall meet. We don't seem to talk about them in the same subject, and even the retirement income review doesn't really talk about aged care as such. It's almost like there's an accumulation phase and then there's a spend phase, but surely they should be very closely intertwined.
Ali, that's right. Cohesion, but also let's put ourselves in the footsteps of a generation of baby boomers. Nobody in history has ever lived as long as baby boomers, and we don't know where that goes. When the pension was first introduced, the age of the pension, 65, was the expected life expectancy of people. And we've walked that forward where the pension is a huge part of the three pillars. If you think about our superannuation system, which leads the world, it's terrific. But when it was introduced only 30 or so years ago, people were expected to be covered until they're 85. And now they've got a plan to live to 95. And likewise for housing. Housing isn't just a source of funding, and it's not just a house. It's your identity, it's your family, it's your community, it's housing, and it's a source of funding. But it's not ready yet to be a cohesive part of the three pillars, and we've got to walk with baby boomers and retirees, but we've got to get moving because it's getting too late. So the superannuation system has to move from accumulation to retirement, and home equity has to move from housing to housing, community, and funding.
Let me go back to the Minister and pose that question to you again, Senator Hume, about as a point of policy, do you believe if people can afford to contribute to their aged care, they should contribute? That might be through home equity, it might be through some sort of HEC-style system, as has been proposed by Paul Keating.
Well, that's the system that we have now. Aged care is fully subsidised, well, not fully subsidised, but is significantly subsidised by the federal government. I think the last data that I saw, we spent around $20 billion on aged care in 2018-19. 98% of that came from the federal government. But the aged care system, despite the fact it is subsidised, does require some contribution from those that are using it who can afford and that is considered as part of the retirement income review as an ancillary service like health that is well subsidised in retirement, and something that perhaps isn't necessarily considered by those that are planning their retirement income. That we find that a lot of people hang on to their superannuation. They end up dying with a large portion of their superannuation intact because they're nervous about what might happen to them with regard to health and aged care. I suppose what they don't fully understand, and perhaps that's the onus is on the government to explain that to them, that so much of that is well subsidised by the government in Australia.
But I guess, though, that people do die often with a lot of their super. They also die often owning their own home completely and utterly and passing it on to a generation who doesn't always need it. Do you think that the issue of the exemption of the family home, the principal place of residence, the exemption of that from the qualification for the pension, should at least have a cap on it?
You're asking me, Ali?
I am, yes.
No, look, I think that the government has made it pretty clear that we will always maintain the exemption of the family home in the assets test. Look, that said, what we want to see is a retirement income system with that cohesion between the three pillars, using the taper rates of the age pension, using superannuation more effectively rather than hanging on to it, making sure that there's appropriate decumulation products available to people so that they can more effectively use their superannuation, and then also using that voluntary savings component, and potentially that may well be the family home, to amp up or wind down any additional income that they may need.
Well, we will come back to that issue of home equity, but if I can turn to Deanne Stewart now. Deanne, where do you see the biggest gaps in public in government policy, and how do you see that government policy working together with super, with private savings to get a better outcome for people in retirement?
Thanks, Ali, and also I would like to thank Household Capital for today's panel. It's such an important topic, and I think to answer your question on that, Ali, Aware Super has quite a unique member base, but also a unique constitution of that member base between what's in accumulation and retirement. So we're actually really seeing this live now. So 25% of our funds under management actually is sitting in retirement, which is quite unique compared to many other funds that have mainly got it in accumulation. And we've also got 2/3 of our members are female. And so what we can see very clearly is the difference between males coming into retirement and females. It's in our data, and we've got over 1 million members. So it's a very good slice of Australia. And what we see heading into retirement is a couple of things. Number one, those heading into retirement have not yet invested enough into the super system to meet ASFA's comfortable standards. So we can see that very clearly in our data. But probably more alarming, and some of that is the fact that the superannuation system is still a young system. So there's 2 more decades to go, quite frankly, before a full earning that 9% or more has started their career right through to the end of the career. So that's part of it, but part of it is also the fact that SG at 9.5% isn't enough for the majority of our members to earn enough for a comfortable retirement. So that's part of it. But secondly, we see a real disparity between males and females. So just to give you our data, females are retiring on 57% of their male counterparts. So when we unpacked that data and we said, well, what's going on underneath here, what we actually see is what's contributing to that. About 1/3 of it is the career break. So taking time out, paternity leave, looking after elderly parents. And about 2/3 of it is due to wage differences. Now, those wage differences are for various different reasons. They might be the different types of roles that they're in, the fact that women tend to work more part-time, and then thirdly, that gender pay gap. So that's what we're seeing in our data, and that's where there's real disparity. I would also say that underneath that data is not just about women, but probably 2 other areas that we see. Clearly those with very low income, and then secondly, those that are more casualised or part-time or in the gig economy. That's where the super system isn't working as perfectly as we'd like to see it work.
And Deanne, I take your point about being sort of 2 decades away from it being a more mature system, but right now, what could help to reduce some of that gap, some of that underfunding, particularly where women are concerned?
There's a few things. I mean, number one, without a shadow of a doubt, moving the SG to 12% has the biggest impact. So let's start there. But beyond that, there's several other things that we would certainly recommend. One is actually to consider joint super accounts, right? So if you think about it, in many households, you've got both partners working and the ability to contribute into the super fund if someone's taking time out or taking a career leave. But also later in life, if there is a separation in the family, that actually really assists in having a much more equal super balance. So that's one thing to consider. Secondly, we would also recommend, particularly both for women and those working part-time or more casualised, looking at reducing that $450 threshold, because that actually does stop. A lot of people we see might work 1 day a week here, 1 day a week there when they're coming back from paternity leave, and that more casualisation, but they're then excluded from the superannuation system. So what we then see, particularly we see in women, is 1 in 3 women get to retirement without superannuation. So there's some of the things that we think actually would make a huge difference to women, but also those working more part-time and casualised.
So, Minister, I know you've got Deanne right on your left there, so you might have given her a quick kick under the table, but we've now got it on the table for discussion, SG at 12%, but also joint super accounts and the idea of moving the $450 threshold. Good ideas. And on the 12%, you're going to give us a little bit of an insight as to what's happening there?
So let's start with the broader issue of women's and the gender retirement gap, which is a very real issue. But it's actually a design fault with superannuation, because super will always be reflective of your working life. And if women have a different working life to men, they will have a different superannuation balance. And what is it that you are trying to fix here? Are you trying to fix the super system to adjust for the working life, or should you try and adjust the working life so that it better suits the retirement system, or so that it better suits women more broadly? And I've got to say, one of the things that I was most proud of at the beginning of this year was that we had a higher rate of female participation rate in the workforce than we had ever seen before, and the gender pay gap had closed accordingly from around 17.5% 4 or 5 years ago to around 14.5% or 14.2% at the beginning of this year. Now that made a real difference, and would be making a difference to that gender retirement gap. Are there, of course, things that are slightly different because we're now in a post-COVID environment, and those statistics could have changed. However, that said, there are some equity issues with superannuation as well, and I think that they are worth considering. I know that the 450 issue has come up over and over again. That I don't think is an issue of adequacy. Even if you solve the 450 problem, you wouldn't create adequate retirement income. So, I think you can put that in the bucket of an equity issue rather than an adequacy issue. So if that's the problem you're trying to solve, that's not the solution. But there are other issues too. I think that, superannuation on paid parental leave is something that I know has come up over and over again, and something that's probably worth considering. The joint accounts, I quite like that idea, and something that I think that should be considered also. However, we also know that those that are retiring, particularly women that are retiring on that lower superannuation balance, tend to be single. So I don't know whether joint accounts necessarily will solve that problem either, but I think that's certainly worth consideration. But I think that there is good work that can be done on both sides of the equation, both on the super side and also on the workforce side.
And Deanne, if I can just come back to you, because there's one other thing that you're doing that is fascinating when you look at it, not just being, well, if you look at the issue of accumulation on one side and then retirement on the other, of course, this also goes to the issue of having a stapled super fund. But as you get older, as I get older, I don't want my funds in the same level of risk that I had them when I was 25. I want to reduce my risk with my age. That would seem to be logical. I understand that you're looking at something that would provide that opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Ali. We certainly are, and the technical term we've given it is a really good glide path into retirement. And what we've looked at, because we've got such a unique member base and we've got so many into retirement, we've looked at the different risks. You've got the market risk, you've got longevity risk, but you've also got what's called sequencing risk. So as you're heading into retirement, if there's massive corrections in the market, like we've seen this year, those that are right near retirement could be hugely exposed to having a significant drop in their income. So what we're looking to do over this next year is actually change our default fund so that it has much higher growth, quite frankly, in the earlier years, because ultimately that's what you want in those first few decades, is to get as high a growth as possible. But then how you actually glide into retirement and actually look at that retirement path. And so it makes sure that it's appropriate for the different stages in our members' lives. And that's probably one of the concerns that we have with stapling right at the beginning with funds that just stay in balanced fund mode, is that might be okay when you're younger with that high growth, but actually as you middle age and then into nearing retirement, actually a different profile makes sense. And certainly all the work that we've done and the actuaries involved in it show that difference would make a huge difference to someone's retirement.
Ali, can I just jump in on that particular issue? Because I think that the word glide path is a really powerful one. And I think that that's what the government is looking at when it's considering the retirement income review. Not necessarily a dollar adequacy level that you were talking about there. The ASFA has a comfortable standard and a moderate standard, but making sure that consumption is smooth throughout your working life to your retired life. We don't want a system whereby your retired life is 10 times better than your working life in terms of your income, and we certainly don't want a system where your income in your working life is much better than your retired life. We want that transition to be very, very smooth. So it's not just a part of the accumulation process, that should be part of the decumulation process as well, and that's what the retirement income review is addressing.
Just two very quick questions, though, Minister, in terms of what Deanne just put forward. One, of course, is the stapling, the risk that if you staple, you don't necessarily allow that flexibility to reduce risk as you get older. The second thing is that if you are in a reduced risk fund, how would that work with the performance tests that are being introduced as per the last budget?
So there's two issues that you brought up there. The first is stapling. One of the things that we're doing as part of this stapling process, the package should be looked at as a whole rather than as single elements. When you staple somebody to the fund, all that means is that they don't create unintended multiple accounts. They can change out of their fund at any time to a fund that better suits their needs. And that's where that second element comes in, using the comparison tool so they can see which fund best suits their needs on the basis of returns and also on the basis of risk. Whereas the underperformance measure simply means that those funds that are underperforming need to go to their members and say, on a rolling 8-year basis, we underperformed our own benchmark here. We are not living up to our reputation. We're not living up to the standards that we set ourselves. And here is the comparison tool if you want to switch to another fund. What we really want is people to be more engaged in their superannuation and more engaged, including their superannuation as part of their personal balance sheet. And we think that the combination of the comparison tool plus that element of accountability of the funds to their members and the stapling will combine to create that level of engagement.
Thank you, Minister. Peter Harris, if I can come to you and if we can return to this issue of housing, which I know when you're at the Productivity Commission you did a lot of work on. What do you see as the main barriers to staying at home and at the same time funding your own retirement and funding also the care that you might need?
The primary barrier, I think, is people's natural risk aversion to incurring obligations, debt or other obligations as they age in an attempt to improve either their lifestyle or their health or things like that. It's not the only impediment. I think the Minister had referred to it as well a bit earlier, but managing your way through the aged care system in terms of government support is incredibly complex. I'm doing it for my mother at the moment, so I'm very much aware of this. So complexity and I think fear of incurring debt or other obligations are two substantial impediments to people taking advantage of opportunities to help themselves in their retirement. And I think ultimately, Andrew might have referred to this a little earlier, the third element is as people age, and we have some information from survey work the Productivity Commission did on this, and it wasn't a survey conducted for the purpose of finding a conclusion. It was a survey genuinely intended to gather information about people's actual perceptions back in 2015, but nevertheless, I think still the most contemporary survey of its kind. And that is, as people get even older, they predetermine for themselves that their real intent in retirement is to pass on an asset. And so they compound this question of risk aversion and complexity by then convincing themselves that their job is to pass on an asset to the next generation. The downside of that from an economic perspective is consumption that could have occurred in their lifetime does not occur. It's deferred until death and therefore does not occur. And the benefit of that is passed on to persons who, roughly my age. So I'm in my 60s. People at my age too are not likely to be very substantial consumers of services versus people much younger. And so what we're doing is we're locking up an asset for the long haul that isn't subsequently transformed into an asset that generates additional economic activity through consumption, therefore additional employment, things like that. We have structured the system, not deliberately, but by a series of both natural inclinations of people of a particular age and the complexities of both the tax system and the aged care system to encourage people to hold on to an asset and not consume.
And indeed, Peter, if I can come in there and just say, well, I guess we know that we know that people are incredibly hesitant, that natural reticence. To what extent, how do you change that? And how do you change that, particularly in the context of government policy that doesn't encourage you to think of the family home as a source of capital? Yes, there's a pensioner loan scheme, but by making it exempt for the purposes of qualifying for the pension, it's almost saying it's this sacrosanct, asset out there. We won't touch it. We can't touch it. So how, in that environment, how do you make people think of the family home as a source of capital?
Well, in the broader social welfare system run in this country and run in most other countries, there are opportunities for people to end up with the equivalent of a case manager for their particular service recipient or the service under the social welfare system. So I'll call them a navigator. And what's a navigator? It's a person who provides better information in your particular circumstances. We don't really develop such people for the purposes of ageing. We do have, in my aged care, we have an interview process which determines whether or not you might qualify for assistance at home, but it's not really about managing your particular circumstances. Whereas if we contrast that with, say, the finance system, we have a plethora of financial advisors out there to tell you where to put your money whilst you're still working. We just don't have anybody to tell you where to put your money and how to most benefit yourself in your retirement. And you can say, therefore, there's an obligation here, and in my view, this is my personal view, there is an obligation here, not just on government, but it would help if government was to reduce the apparent threat of accessing in a careful way the assets that you build up over a lifetime by an information campaign. But equally, I mean, in my view, superannuation funds have obligations to their members about this, and I find the information provision from superannuation funds to be, again, very risk averse when it comes to this. So I would say, even though you wouldn't say aged care is a perfect obligation for a super fund, it is worth considering whether information to people from a trusted advisor, and a superannuation fund is a classic trusted advisor by comparison with, say, your run-of-the-mill financial advisor. I think these things, information provision, are very important.
Jean Kitson, from the research that you did with your book and indeed your own experience with your parents, I mean, the home is sacrosanct, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. My parents they've worked, 2 lifetimes worth of work, and they've been very frugal. They've never had a holiday to Paris or anything like that, and not even Wagga Wagga, if I remember, but they've always saved for the family home. And the family home, they couldn't even consider the idea of spending the money from the family home on their own care. They would consider that was squandering the lifetime of saving for the family home. So it is in their DNA and their psyche that the family home is their largest financial achievement. And what they want to do with that is pass it on to the children. And it's also, for many of my parents' friends, they're owning their own home is an insurance for their own children and their grandchildren, who are increasingly finding it difficult to find work, to buy their own homes. So the grandparents' home has become the home for the children and the grandchildren, and the asset for them as well. So, I mean, I know from myself that my children aren't going to have near the same opportunity to own their own home as I had, and I would consider the family home something that I would like to have to pass on as an asset. There's a lot of, in my research for my book, We Need to Talk About Mum and Dad, I found there was a lot of fear about aging and aged care especially the capacity to pay for your care. It's not like people feel entitled to care. It's just that selling the family home for their own care doesn't seem worth it. People don't want to spend it on their own care. And I think that fear, it also comes out of that narrative that older Australians are a burden. That has been a terrible narrative, and I think it sets up a conflict between older Australians and people who are making financial policy and economists and things, and that puts everyone in a defensive mode. But I think what Peter was saying about financial advice, for my book, I interviewed people who are they call it later life advice, and they have a whole different set of governing sort of prerequisites for advising older people. As we've been talking about, it's the sort of decumulation phase and the orderly drawdown of assets and liquefying your assets, which is often a conflict of interest with many financial advisors because they get their fees from investments. But you need to as much liquidity as you can. And so the idea of maybe drawing some liquidity from your home, maybe that's going to be a lot more acceptable to people, so that they can pay for more of their own care. So some of the equity, but having the whole home put up to pay for your care is, I think, always going to be a sticking point for Australians.
And that's even though being poor and retired is no fun.
No, it's not not any fun, but my parents are pensioners and they don't have a sort of, they don't imagine, they have lives, not lifestyles. I think we're all sort of getting into the zone of, our lifestyles, but they have good lives with their families and very modest lives, and they manage, they manage quite well like that. So, but being poor, the ones who, just to reflect back on the women, the ones who are struggling the most, my mother and father are lucky because they're in their 90s and they still have each other, so they have 2 pensions, but it's the women on their own, mostly women on their own on 1 pension and renting. They're the ones in a lot of strife and who really struggle.
And that actually, Jean raises a really good point there, that of course to access any form of home equity, you have to own a home. And many of those who are in the worst position don't own a home. Josh, let me bring you in now, because of course you have a very close interest in this. This is what you're building a livelihood on. What is stopping people, in your view, using home equity? And is it very much, as we've heard both Peter and Jean say, it's emotional as much as anything else?
Well, Ali, let me just pick up on the point that was just raised by Jean, because it's a profound one. We're here to talk about the 3 pillars, their cohesion, and how we can get them to work for Australians. But many Australians, particularly single retired Australians, particularly single female retired Australians, have only 1 pillar, and it's the pension. And where those Australians are in the private rental market, they're amongst the poorest and most vulnerable of Australians. So that's not a question about 3 pillars, that's a question about helping those people live with dignity throughout their lives. So we all need to come together and agree on a whole range of help that's needed to make sure those aged Australians aren't vulnerable, aren't poor, and can live with dignity. That's a really important thing that I think isn't about 3 pillars of cohesion, it's about helping a very large and vulnerable group. But to your question, and it's a terrific one, and thank you, there is nothing stopping Australians at the moment responsibly accessing their home equity as the 3rd pillar of their own retirement funding plan. But we are dealing with a much bigger issue here that Peter Harris and the Minister alluded to. Australian retirees are worried. They've never lived as long, where they're seen as a burden, and when they're uncertain about the complexity that faces them, they are worried, they don't spend, they don't have as good a lifestyles as they could, and the whole economy and community suffers. So the ambition here is to get retirees confident in their finances and in their lives, and that's a benefit to absolutely everybody. And historically, the bank reverse mortgage market did not give them that confidence, and retirees were correct not to take confidence from that. There are a range of problems. It was complex, it was poorly regulated by the states, it was not transparent, and so it was hard for people to understand, and that's the primary thing. There are 3 big issues in the old system that retirees were right to be suspicious about, but are largely overlooked in our current policy parameters. Firstly, most Australians back then taking a reverse mortgage were seen as last resort borrowers, but the banks also provided home equity that was consumed in the first couple of years. And that left those Australian retirees without a retirement funding or income plan and an increasing debt. You should not do that, and that's not fair on those retirees. Secondly, a long time ago, and this is perhaps true of Jean's parents, people from the Second World War era, before the baby boomers, tended to die at around 75 and left the home to their kids to help them get into housing or pay off the home and to help the grandchildren get through university. Now, most baby boomers need to plan to live till they're 90 and 95, like Jean's parents, luckily enough. And that means that there's a bequest gap. Children doesn't make a bigger difference when you inherit when you're Peter Harris's age, as he's suggested. To get that savings intergenerationally transferred when children need it, to be the bank of mum and dad, Australia's 5th biggest bank, when you live to 90, you need access while you're alive, not as a bequest after you left. That was a second big problem. The third big problem was much more fundamental and is still widely misunderstood, and I think what's stopping Australians is understanding what's changed since then. But historically, you could lose your home. And to access equity in your home meant your home was either housing or funding, and it couldn't be both at the same time with adequate government protections or statutory protections. Now, A lot's changed since then. Retirees are living 10 years longer. Australia has the world's best regulation and statutory protections for any form of home equity access, and it's functioning very well. It's been reviewed by ASIC after the 2012 legislation. None of this aspect of financial services came up in the Royal Commission. So we've done a really good job there.
Can I just interrupt you there? Two things that would appear way beyond the psychological and the emotional, but just two very factual things. One is that even if you do access equity in your home, you can't put it into super in a concessionary way as you could, for example, if you sold the home and downsized, which I would imagine is a disincentive. And the other is that the part of your home that you are selling, you will be selling at a discount to what you might get eventually in terms of a market. You're definitely taking a punt. How do you, how do you ameliorate those concerns?
So look, any form of home equity access doesn't involve necessarily a sale. It can be a debt facility, a partial sale, and there's a range of new innovations that are responsible and long term. So those pricing aspects can broadly be said it needs to be transparent and the pricing needs to be improved. Neither of those two things was the case 10 years ago. Both of them are better now on that technical issue, Ali, that you referred to. What's different now is you can never lose your home. And your home can both be guaranteed your lifetime home and housing, it can keep you in community, and it can also help fund your retirement as the third pillar. That's the big difference that provides a statutory guarantee, but also a conceptual breakthrough. It's not either or. Your home can be the best place to live and the right way to fund your retirement. There's a bunch of other things that have changed since then that I think we need to provide information, reduced complexity, and greater confidence in the home as the third pillar. And that's nothing stopping us in a technical sense or a legal sense, but everything stopping us. When people think about reverse mortgages, they're right to think about the problems of the old market more than 10 years ago. So the name itself brings with it the old problems, not the new opportunities. There is an identification there. But just think, our surveys say 80% of Australians are aware that their home is a huge asset for them to fund retirement. The academic research in Australia says that 43% of people will be open to using their home equity to fund their retirement. And if they were, they'd use 13% of their home equity. So there's $1 trillion of home equity in Australia owned by retirees. If all of them used their home equity for the long term, not the short, responsibly to fund their retirement, we've got $130 billion to start helping retirees get through 30 years in retirement. So communicating the benefits of that, the opportunities, in a non-compulsory way, is the challenge that we face.
And Andrew Boyle, that sort of goes to that issue of bank of mum and dad. And as Jean was saying, you know, people want to pass their home on to their kids. And maybe, I don't know, Peter feels he's too old. I think most kids would be very happy to receive whatever they are lucky enough to receive. But I had no idea just how important the bank of mum and dad actually is. So how do you be bank of mum and dad and also make sure that your own retirement's pretty comfortable?
That's a key. Retirement's all about managing risk and having the confidence, as Josh has said, about the confidence to spend your money earlier in retirement. It'd be much, much better for the bank of mum and dad to be able to provide some capital to their children when they're 25 or 30 rather than when they're 50 or 60 to get them into their first home when it makes a difference to their life. But having the confidence to spend that money not only on yourself but on your children that early in your retirement. Now, the things about retirement, it's all about managing those risks, and there's the retirement risks. We've talked about market risk and sequencing risk and the like. But the cost of health care after age 85 is about 5 times higher than the cost of health care for a 35-year-old. And then you've got aged care. Am I going to need it? To what extent? I don't know. So I'm going to have to reserve a whole lot of capital just for those things, just in case. And so how we find ways to give people confidence to spend money on themselves earlier in retirement and also to be the bank of mum and dad if need be, and to start to get over this idea that I have to have a whole lot of money left over when I die. Wouldn't it be better for everybody if they were able to spend it on themselves and on their children whilst it made a difference to everybody's lives rather than at the end when they'll find a way to use it when they get it eventually.
But how do you do that? Because you might have the best retirement plan in the world and everything's set and you look great and you've worked out how much you're going to need. You're going to live until 95. And then at the age of 87, one of you is diagnosed with dementia or there's a major property crash or someone in your family is sick. Like there are just so many unknown unknowns as well as known unknowns.
Yes, and you can't manage all of them. And I think one of the things you just mentioned there that 30% of Australians over the age of 85 have dementia. And so that's a really big problem. And I think they make up about 52% of all people in residential aged care. It's because of dementia. And so And these are expensive things to manage for society. The cost of aged care is going to grow from about 0.8% of GDP now to 2% of GDP over the next 40 years, so way more than double. So you can't manage all the risks though, but what we've got to try and do is, especially for those that I call the middle, the wealthy can do some things for themselves, and those with low superannuation account balances, the age pension will be the primary source of income for them in retirement, and some of the examples we talked about before will be looking for a leg up to make sure that they're looked after by the rest of us, and that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. We have to look after the vulnerable. But that group in the middle who aspire to being self-funded just don't know how to manage these risks. So we have to look at things like longevity protection, pooling products to help people manage some of the risks.
You're talking deferred annuity, aren't you?
Deferred annuities are one of the products that, and this is part of the retirement income review we'll be looking at. We've had SIPPers have been on the table for a while, comprehensive income products for retirement. These sort of products that help pool some of the risks, that you try not to manage them all yourselves. And maybe it's time we started thinking about some of the other risks that we can also start saving in advance for and pooling the risks so that those that are unfortunately are affected by them can benefit from the resources of some others to help ameliorate some of those risks.
I mean, arguably, that is what the age pension is.
The age pension is a great base that does that really effectively for a lot of people. But then there's another tier that we can maybe pre-fund to help get another level of security for people and giving them the confidence then to spend their money in retirement. If you look at people in retirement, we're living longer, yes, and about half of that is healthy. But it's usually after about 8 to 10 years that you get some creeping disability coming into your life. And by about age 81, 82, half the population are living with a severe or profound disability. And so these complications don't affect everybody, but you want to at least be able to live the first 10 years of your retirement enjoying it before the body starts to wear out.
Amara, if I could bring you in here, because as I noted earlier, you used to work for Challenger. It's a very big voice for products such as deferred annuities. Do you see something like that, this pooling of risk for our older retirement? Do you think that is the way to go?
I think it's one way to go. For me, I think product solution sets are important. I think that they don't come before the advice part of that process. So all the work that we do in retirement theory, I suppose, suggests that in order for people to get that confidence that both Josh and Andrew were talking about, some of that is actually starting at ground zero. So it's understanding your budgeting requirements, understanding your lifestyle, understanding your goals. Those sorts of things are paramount. And in order to understand what a product solution set should be for any given person, you need to get the advice part of that right. And when I say advice, I'm very clear about not necessarily using it in the same context as the regulated definition of advice. There's a lot of other things that we're now seeing pop up around the world in terms of, as an antithesis to say, full service advice. So we talk about guidance, financial counselling. It all comes back to getting the basics right to get people confident. And then once you've got them over the line, once you've got them understanding their own retirement needs, then you can start looking at products definitely like DLAs, because I think that there is definitely a place for DLAs for many people, particularly, as Andrew points out, the part pensioner. But yes, getting the basics right is the
It's interesting though, because you talk about advice, and I know that in a conversation that we had offline, and then I started to talk about education, and you said, yes, well, there's never been a problem in the world that education can't fix. And you made the point that it's a little like what's under the bonnet of a car. Some people care, some people don't. So how do you ensure that people seek out and get the right advice, and the right advice for the period of life that they're in? And that circles back to the question of the staple super fund and ensuring that you're in a fund appropriate to your time of life.
There's many different things to answer, many different ways to answer that question. One of the things you've touched on there is, how do you get people engaged? I think one of the things we experience in the pre-retirement stage is that people are automatically more engaged. They know that retirement's coming, they're starting to plan, and that is just a natural uptick. Something like half of pre-retirees will access an advisor, and that's the largest percentage that you'll find across the lifespan. Typically, the first question that they will ask is, how much money do I have to spend? And if they've asked that question early enough before retirement and not the day before, they might have some extra time to plan. We find a varying degree of when people ask that question. For those that are planning, they will make that effort, they will get engaged, they might contribute more, they might understand what their profile is, they might move their investments accordingly, they might understand their goals and needs at that point. For other people, they may not. And depending also on where you are demographically, for some people, asking how much money do I have to retire on or how much money can I live off tends to be synonymous with, will I get the age pension? How much age pension will I get? There are people around the industry that have managed to work this out as well and have enabled an environment where you go, okay, well, let's use that point. There is a general enough Australian understanding out there that the government will help pensioners and that there is an age pension. So it ends up being the first port of call. Where super funds are paramount in this conversation is helping people understand not only how their age pension works, but also how their own super balances that they have, how that ties in with their age pension. So then you start to get degrees and shades of more engagement as we go through this process for a retiree. And then it continues on. So you've worked through your budgeting, you've worked through your understanding of where you're at with your age pension, you understand where you're at with your superannuation. And then there's further things at play. One of the things I'd like to make mention that hasn't been mentioned before on this panel is we have an understanding of home being the equity, but for many people, we are taking debt into retirement because there is a mortgage against the home. There's something like 36% of homeowners are now carrying some sort of mortgage into retirement, and that is up from 23% 10 years prior. That's a really important stat, and I think that we need to remember that not only is the home the varying context that we find at the home in, the source of the age pension, the source of wealth, possible bequest, all of those things, it is for many people also still a source of debt at retirement. We know that for people that are taking out lump sums at the point of retirement, the number one reason they take out a lump sum is to pay off their mortgage because they're taking that mortgage into retirement. So we need to balance out all of these things. That all comes back to your engagement issue of understanding these things holistically. In an early retirement conversation, we don't talk about aged care enough. We don't, and it's something I personally lament that in the financial services sector, we think aged care is someone else's problem. It's another industry's problem. I personally lament that we need to be better as an industry about being much more cohesive about these things, and I applaud the Retirement Income Review in general for having to start that conversation about bringing these things together. I'm hopeful that the Aged Care Royal Commission will actually help that as well. And so we move through these conversations, we get better engagement as we get older. Your stapling point's very interesting, something perhaps scandalous to say, and I'm all about being scandalous occasionally because it's fun, is one of the things we've tossed back and forth at Milliman is what would a world look like if people had to exit MySuper at 45 or 55? We're at the point where, because stapling and there are early accumulation and default issues that are real and required, the proliferation of accounts, all of that sort of things, those are all important, but they don't, from a retirement perspective, they're not as important. These notions about understanding your retirement, understanding your lifestyle, your goals, all of that kind of stuff that we look at, one of the key things that might be in place is what happens if you're not in a default? And what would happen if everyone got kicked out of their default and they were forced to engage? Now, I don't know behaviourally whether or not that works. I have talked about this in the past with people, various elders in the community about what they think about that. And it's scandalous because forcing engagement is tough, but equivalently staying in the same fund, and I go back to Leanne's point about risk management and how that works with late accumulation. For us, in retirement theory, late accumulation and pre-retirement is almost the same. So the needs of a late accumulator are different in 25. So what systems and what processes and policies can you have in place to force engagement so that people are going through that point of financial self-awareness and reflection? Maybe that forces them, maybe.
You've got one of the key decision makers sitting right beside you. So, Senator Hume, I mean, engagement is a huge challenge. It's always been a challenge. It doesn't seem to matter what people do. A huge number of people don't even open the email from their super fund. What about kicking people out of a basic fund when they turn 45 or whatever the number is? It is a forced engagement. Would that not be a good thing?
Well, I think that it's an interesting idea and one that I haven't heard of before. Thanks for that blind side there, Amara. But it's funny you should say that, because obviously, the early release of superannuation scheme that we saw as a response to COVID-19 did have an unexpected happy byproduct. I mean, it was 2.8 million Australians accessed their superannuation as an emergency measure. And some of those, in fact, the majority of those probably had never actually considered superannuation as part of their personal balance sheet before that time. And then all of a sudden they were asking themselves, well, where does that nearly $1.10 of everything that I earn go, and who's looking after it, and are they responsive to my needs? Have they performed? If I take my money out now, what's the effect on my retirement, at my balance at retirement? How can I contribute more? So we've had that a new level of engagement that we've never seen before, and I think that that's a really important thing for the government to leverage from. And I think that the budget response actually has demonstrated a willingness to leverage that new level of engagement. But I want to go back to that issue that Amara raised of financial advice and the importance of financial advice. I think that the financial advice industry in Australia has morphed so dramatically from where it began, probably in the late 1980s, early 1990s, from essentially that sales culture to a profession. That's been an uncomfortable journey, I think, for many of the people that are involved in that profession, but we are moving in the right direction. The trick now is to try and unravel some of the overburdensome red tape in the financial advice sector to make it more accessible and to make it less expensive to get some basic advice. Now, I think that we're getting there. I think we saw a willingness from our regulators during COVID-19 to, remove some of those regulatory burdens, things like getting single issue advice on something like the early release of superannuation. That was a really positive step forward. Now I think the trick is how to broaden it out. I think financial advisors, I liken them to politicians. People say, oh, financial advisors, they're all shonks, except for mine. I love mine. Mine's great. Politics are the same. Everybody hates politicians except their local member who's a good guy. Or a good girl, I should say. I think that the trick now is to how do we make financial advice far more accessible. There's some really interesting technological solutions. I know everyone talks about robo-advice. That means a different thing to, ask 10 different people what robo-advice looks like. You'll get 10 different answers. But the opportunity to, first engage with your retirement through something that is not necessarily personal advice or one-on-one or something that's going to cost you money is actually a really good catalyst to taking people to that next step of advice, and something that we would like to see used a little bit more. Potentially, we have been talking about getting the regulators to look at the algorithms within robo-advice solutions and ticking them off for compliance as opposed to the product at the end. And that way we know that if you get a certain level of basic advice from a robo-advice solution, you've got a compliant, very basic financial plan that might be the catalyst for the next step.
Mm-hmm. We are rapidly running out of time, so I just want to take some questions from the audience. And this one is, Minister, again, it's for you. It's not every day that people have access to someone who makes decisions. I'm just giving you the question straight as it's come to us. My name is Margaret. I'm 80 years of age. I've worked my whole life either in paid or unpaid work. When I retired, I had 30,000 in superannuation. Clearly, the super system doesn't support working women raising a family. I was able to use my home equity loan to keep the home I love living in by refinancing my mortgage, buying a much needed new car, and have funds each month to top up my pension. What are the superannuation levers this government is pulling to ensure that super starts working for women, especially during and post-COVID? And could I top up my super with my home equity?
Well, thank you for that. And thank you, Margaret, for that question. Look, you're absolutely right. I think we spoke earlier about how the superannuation system by design reflects your working life, and particularly for somebody who is 80, they grew up for most of their working years, didn't actually have either compulsory superannuation or had it at a much lower rate. I know when I started working in financial services back in the early 1990s, I'm giving away my age now, I had superannuation from day one, but it was at 3%. And so, I haven't grown up with a fully mature superannuation system. And as Deanne said, I think it's going to be another 20 years. Mm-hmm. Yeah, about 20 years before we see people coming through with a fully mature superannuation system. Now, that said, though, Margaret, one of the things that this government has done to help the next generation of women is put in a concessional cap on contributions. And this is really important. So at the moment, you can contribute 9.5% you compulsorily contribute 9.5% of your income, but you can also contribute more should you wish to, up to $25,000. That's the cap. Not only that, but if you don't contribute up to $25,000, whatever remains between the 9.5% that you put in and the $25,000 cap, you can roll forward into future years. So when you do have a little bit of money, if you do have more income in one particular year or two particular years because you've started back in the workforce, then back to school, whatever it might be, you have an opportunity to contribute more to make up the difference for that time away from the workforce. I think that's really important. In addition, we've changed the non-concessional caps. So $100,000 a year you can put in from your post-tax income as well, and you can bring forward 3 years of that, 2 years of that, so you can actually contribute $300,000 in a go in any 1 3-year period. And that's really helpful, I think, particularly for women who find themselves, say, with a small inheritance, or great Auntie Maud dies and leaves you $150,000, and that's terrific. You can put that straight into your superannuation straight away and have it start compounding for you. So when you get to retirement, your balance is that bit bigger. I think having that flexibility about how you put money into superannuation is really important.
What about the last part of her question, though? Could I top up my super with my home equity?
I'm not entirely sure that you would want to do that. I don't know whether it would be a tax-effective thing to do. And it really does depend on how you use your home equity. For instance, if you use your home equity as an income top-up, just as drip feeding, I'm not entirely sure that would be the wisest move. But that said, it's something that you could receive financial advice upon.
Andrew?
Just one thing that was mentioned there, I'm not sure about Margaret's circumstances, but Deanne mentioned earlier about joint accounts. And 70% of people going into retirement enter retirement as part of a couple. But one of the things that, and women do live longer, so often they outlive their male partner and therefore are left as a single pensioner later in life. But one of the other issues that we haven't talked about much is divorce and splitting of assets. And I've gone through this experience unfortunately, with a couple of friends, and they've sought me out, not for advice, but a little bit of guidance and information. But in talking that with them, we're splitting up the house and we're doing the other things. What about your super? Make sure you get this. It's been so hard to get this done. I don't care about the super. And so superannuation really needs to be, and getting coaching and advice around the time of splitting assets or divorce is really important. So I think a lot of women may have entered retirement with not enough superannuation, partially because they didn't get good advice at the time of a separation.
Mm. Does someone want to comment on that? I can briefly look around and see who's... Yep, Deanne?
Just to build on Andrew's point, that's exactly right. And I think that's why when we look at how to help the system work a lot better for females, definitely addressing and knowing exactly what's happening, what's creating the gap, and then into retirement, why, particularly single women really exposed. And I certainly think looking at both the joint accounts, but also looking at the laws behind splitting of super when there is a separation, are absolute areas to really address, because I think that will address a significant part of the issue. But the other element, and you mentioned it earlier, Minister, is go back to why is there a gap in the first place and how do we help address that? So the first time we see in our data a real difference happen between males and 50 and males and females, it's literally at that childbearing age. And so having super paid throughout paternity leave and considering that joint account as well, we think are two really practical, pragmatic ways of helping really address the situation.
Mari, also, yep.
Yeah, I've had some really interesting experiences lately, which are not great in my own friendship circle, so women childbearing age. I am fortunate enough to have a number of friends who are breadwinners as females in their family, and I've had two separate divorce stories in my life where the female breadwinner's superannuation has been penalised in a family law split. Yeah. And I think there's a real opportunity for those in that part of law to understand that just because at the present day we have a scenario where it's unequal assets doesn't mean that translates. And that even though a female might be ahead at a certain point in time early on, that doesn't necessarily mean that will still play out 20 or 30 years from now. Yeah. And I think that there's a real opportunity there to get that communication out there.
Jean, can I ask you, I mean, in all the research that you did, would you come up with the overwhelming recommendation, if you can possibly avoid it, don't get divorced?
I'll be divorced, and maybe the death of a partner that leaves you on your own. But definitely divorce is just an added burden emotionally and financially for everyone. So stick together if you can, even though you might be like my parents, who I think it's their arguments that keep them alive. They just fight the whole time.
Yeah, I don't think you'd be on your own with that one. We're going to squeeze in one quick question, which I'm actually going to put, I'll get Peter. Peter, if you can consider this audience question. Australia has an estimated 4 to 7 million empty bedrooms in existing homes. Many are in the homes of empty nesters. These homes and empty bedrooms could be freed up to be occupied by younger growing families. Should the government remove some of the barriers to encourage, not force, older Australians to move out of their home? This particular question goes back to reforming the way the age pension means test works, maybe getting rid of stamp duty. Do you think there need to be more incentives for the home to be on the table, Peter?
Well, the research that we referred to earlier, the 2015 Research the Productivity Commission did, indicated that people weren't that keen on such incentives. And it was primarily because the determination to age in place meant age in that location. And so I do think you can make a fairly simple economic argument to say it'd be great to see assets better utilised, but you have to take into account the wishes of the individual. And I think in older age, people who decide to age in place, and that's the majority, by a long way, the majority, do so because of the community and not just the facility. And people use their bedrooms for other purposes, supposedly hobbies and things like that. So I'm personally not very big on the idea of creating incentives just because we think we can identify for an individual a better use for their asset. It's not to say governments should not reconsider impediments, and stamp duty is an absolutely classic impediment. A very poorly considered tax, really, relative to some others. But would I do it to encourage older people to move? I think I'd want to give that wider consideration.
Look, we've got about...
Can I just pop in there, Ali? Sorry, because we do have one incentive for people to downsize, and that is the downsizer contribution to superannuation. So if you are over 65 and you sell your house, you can contribute $300,000 to your superannuation on top of any other contribution. So it doesn't get considered against your concessional or non-concessional balances or contributions. And not only that, it's not just 300,000 for one person, but it's 300,000 per person. So a couple can actually contribute to their superannuation $600,000 from downsizing their home, but they can only do it the one time.
But I guess that doesn't recognise that the research, as Peter was telling us, so many people want to stay in their home. They don't want to downsize.
That's right. It's only an incentive to do so. It's certainly not compulsory.
And on the other side of the ledger there, you get the $600,000 goes into a financial asset. So it was previously in the home that was exempt from the means tests, and now it's into a means tested environment, which is a disincentive.
I could get the impression we could keep this conversation going for a substantial period of time on incentives and disincentives. But look, in the sort of 8 minutes or so that we have left, I just wanted to go round to each of our panel members and try and sort of draw some of the threads together by asking if you were in charge. Jane Hume obviously is more in charge than many of us when it comes to decision making. But if there was one thing that you think would make the biggest difference to people, more people having a more comfortable retirement, what do you think it would be? Deanne, if I can start with you.
That's easy for me, and that is actually us really sorting through how to make advice affordable, getting really good quality advice leading into retirement and in retirement actually is threading the needle between Pillar 1, Pillar 2 and Pillar 3, and people needing help to navigate that and work out, and actually just reducing that sort of loss aversion and conservative nature and knowing, okay, this is how much I can spend, this is how I create an income into retirement and how long it will last. That makes all the difference, not just to the adequacy of retirement, but quite frankly, to the confidence and the mental health in retirement. So that would be it for me.
Jean, would that be it for you too, given the experiences that you've had?
Yes, absolutely. Everyone I spoke to when I was researching my book, I think that in the financial aspect, and that's my number one top tip, get someone who knows what they're doing, get a professional financial advisor who specializes in later life, because many of us suddenly in retirement have to deal with these great big lumbering bureaucratic ecosystems of like Centrelink and My Aged Care, and they're really complex. We need, and our assets and incomes have to be assessed to access them. It's really does your head in. So if you can get a very good person to just lead you to tell you, give you all the information, like everyone's saying, information about where you stand, it's so comforting and it makes all the difference in the world.
And how easy is that, Jean, to find the person who's got the knowledge and who's got the experience and is the right person?
Well, it's not as hard as you may think. There are people who specialize in later life advice. You can ask around, ask your friends like we all do, who's someone good and who really understands the decumulation phase, the fact that you'll need liquidity when you're in your 80s for maybe aged care bed and all that sort of thing, who understands all the aged care costs, which are so complicated. Like Peter was saying, he's doing it with his parents. I've been doing it with my parents for years. It's incredibly complex navigating all that. So you really need a really good advice. And it's not, they're just Google them and ask your friends.
Peter, what about you?
I'd like to go a bit further than Jean because having done a number of inquiries into the financial sector and read thoroughly the Royal Commission report and actually spoke to the Royal Commission privately into the Royal Commission and the financial system, I'm less confident about financial advisors generally. And I think you would have to have a standard of behaviour that I don't think we currently observe when it comes to this. Remember, we're dealing with people who are, if you're intimidated by the financial system into not getting advice, and that's still the majority of people when you're 40, you're certainly going to be more intimidated, relatively speaking, when you're 75. So I do think we need a form of navigator here, and it has to be a trusted navigator. And I don't like putting the burden on the government to do this myself. I think the government can play some part, but I go back to the point I made earlier, and I have had my own, after I left the Productivity Commission, I actually went to see one of the largest super funds and asked them this question: do you consider that your responsibility, your members, extends to their whole financial perspective, or simply the pension that you believe that they're going to take as a result of having invested in you over years. And the answer was, as I said, quite a risk-verse one. Look, we're just managing the super. Now, I think somewhere between the super fund and the government and the financial advisory industry, there lies a place where older people could and should be able to get advice navigating the system. And I don't think we've developed that. I don't know whether the Retirement Incomes Review, people have referred to it here today as if they're familiar with it. I guess I'm familiar with the work we did at the Productivity Commission. I just don't know what the Retirement Income Review actually looked at. But that area there, somewhere in that intersection, we don't have a service in Australia.
There's got to be obviously some place in amongst all that. Andrew, let me ask you. Is that the answer, advice, but maybe not traditionally as we think of where we're going to get it from?
I think I'd like to separate information and guidance out from advice. Comprehensive advice is something that not a lot of people really need or go for. The wealthy often need that, but the people in the middle are more homogeneous than we think, and that will have similar issues, and they've got their home, they've got the superannuation, and typically not much else. And so we can use technology, robo-advice, whatever you want to call it, but technology to make it more efficient and more affordable to deliver single issue advice to more Australians to make better financial decisions. And I think the problem we've had in the past about advice has been that it's been interlinked with product. We've got to separate out the strategy, which is where 80+% of the value of advice is, from the product you then go into. I think it's up to the government and the regulator, or at least the regulator, to make sure that the product is fit for purpose. And then it doesn't matter so much. Let's get the advice to get the right strategy so it makes a real difference to how you then spend your money.
Minister, if I can come to you for your one thing. I know there are many.
Yeah, I think that there are many, and I think that the panel have already summed up my one thing into about 6 things. But I'd also like to add another factor onto that, which I think it is beholden of government to make sure that engagement with systems is much easier, and particularly something like aged care, and ensuring that there is a better, digital, for want of a better expression, interface that people can go on to better understand and navigate the system is really important. And that is something that we are investing a lot of money in as part of the Digital Job Maker strategy that was announced in the budget. And I think that, the way that we get financial advice, as Andrew was saying, that early single issue advice or early stage advice, combined with the more holistic and personal advice that you get at an older age, combined with specific retirement and ageing advice, I think that's really important continuum to get right as well. And again, something more that we are working on exactly now.
Amara?
Look, I echo the sentiments of everyone on the panel. The only thing I would add to that is that we don't do enough as an industry on the information side. So we talk a lot about the continuum, so full service advice to Andrew's point, but all the way back through to the other end. We are used to, as people now in the information age, Googling whatever it is. And there are still some perceptions of regulatory impediments, and I would actually call out the fact that they are there. But the perception of regulatory impediments and reputational risks that prevent providers and people playing in this space to actually provide information, provide generalised formats of information, that's not happening right now. And we need to be better at that early end so people feel like they're more informed.
Josh, it's your panel, so I'll give you the last word.
It goes well beyond advice. We need to celebrate first Australia's the wealthiest retirees in the world, and also amongst the longest lived. But yet they're still worried. So we have a national dissonance in a generation and more of our citizens. And they're worried because it's complex, it's misunderstood, and we don't know what the future holds. So a much clearer vision to be able to provide retirees with access to all 3 pillars of their wealth at all stages of retirement, with understanding, firstly, empathy that every retirement's different and needs to be understood, the information they need to empower their own decisions to navigate their lives. So to deliver Australians' wealth and longevity to them simply and clearly is what we should all aim for.
Well, a huge thank you to our panel who have joined us from varying parts of Australia, the Senator Jane Hume, Deanne Stewart, Peter Harris, Andrew Boll, Jean Kitson, Amara Haqqani and Josh Funder. And thank you to Household Capital for organising this panel. And of course, if you'd like to watch the whole thing again, maybe you missed a bit, you can go to the Household Capital website. A big thank you to you for tuning in. It is an absolutely vital issue. And of course, this is only the start of what is an ongoing and a very long conversation. Thank you very much for joining us.
Diane has loved her home for 25 years. Now it's helping fund her retirement while she lives in it. Terry and George's home funded their kitchen renovations. Bon appetit, Terry. The income Dave gets from his home equity lets him spend more time with his grandkids. The wealth you've built up in your home could fund the lifestyle you want. What are you doing with your household capital? Call 1300 622